Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is the Regionalism, Federalism and State Politics. For this very discussion and lecture, we have with us in our studio subject expert Dr. Sushila Kaushik, retired professor of Political Science, University of Delhi. With this brief introduction, I welcome her and also request her to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, ma'am.
Thanks a lot, Urshi. Today we will take up another topic on Indian politics, which is quite popular and one which is extremely important to us presently in our politics as such, namely the prevalence of what we call regionalism. India being a very big country with a lot of states, about 29 states right now, but more than the states, with a lot of regions in our country, divided on the basis of language essentially, but also on the basis of socio-economic development, ethnicity and religion and many other factors. So, with the result, over a period of time, we have worked out a lot of identities in our country. There is a lot of political identity in our country based on these socio-cultural factors, which political identity very often has had its impact on our politics in the past, present, maybe in the future also. So, this is where I thought we should deal in greater length with what is regionalism and how it came about in India, what are the historical factors and why is it still very, very strong in our country, even though it is more than 60 years since India became independent and we have had a lot of political water flowing under our bridge in these past 60 years. The issue of regionalism is quite rampant in India, which is not the way it will be in many other countries. There are regional identities in many other countries. We do call north, south, east, west and all that. But here the regional identities are not just geographical, but they are much more than that, cultural factors which are involved in our regional identity. So, this is where we call ourselves as having a lot of regional politics in this particular country. So, regionalism being what it is, one need not view it in a very negative sense, though occasionally it really looks like the regional factors are important in our national politics and sometimes even looks like ruinous to national politics. Often it is being viewed as inimical to national unity or divisive in our politics and thereby it is going against our national unity. But there are also reasons, there are also historical paths where without in any way harming our national unity, our regionalism has been extremely positive, beneficial for the development of various parts of India in the past 60 to 70 years. So, let us see a little bit of how this regionalism was born in this country, how it has grown over the period of time. I will take up for instance one important region in our country where these regional parties have been quite strong and still strong, and even as of today they have become so strong that they have wiped out almost the presence of the national parties in their politics or in election or in any other form. I will take up the Tamil Nadu as a case because their regionalism has been extremely strong over a period of time with tremendous amount of regional parties coming and going, and with national parties like Congress and BJP and CPM or any other party we think of playing only a marginal role in present day politics in Tamil Nadu. So, this regionalism really has come up during the time of the national movement itself. While not being against the freedom struggle, while not being against nationalism as such, very many of these entities in this region or any other region have asserted themselves because they had a very strong cultural past. The regions which have had a very strong language and a language which have been quite old, which could even challenge some of these English language as well as some of the ancient Indian languages like Sanskrit. These areas are the ones where you find the regionalism quite strong, like Tamil Nadu as I said, or Bengal, again where the language is considered to be quite a strong one, the local language Bengali or Tamil or Malayalam. These are languages which have been there for a very long time. With the result, when many of these issues are like language and unity and religion and other things came up in the course of the freedom struggle in India, when people were talking about going back to the Indian traditions and giving up the Western traditions, the British traditions, or when people were getting a little upset about the prevalence of English language at the cost of our local languages, when people had begun talking about, our leaders have begun talking about going back to the Indian culture and Indian traditions, then you have a strong resistance, not merely from one region, but quite a few regions. Because this sort of assertion of India's national identity very often took the shape of language. In the northern part of India, which formed a major portion of India, Hindi definitely was a very strong language. So, when they try to replace English, they try to replace it with Hindi. The result is the non-Hindi states felt themselves left out. Tamil Nadu was one of those which had a non-Hindi state, which even had an anti-Hindi agitation, where the caste structure, the caste movements were very different from the caste structure and the caste movements in the rest of India. We find themselves asserting themselves. Same is true about Bengali. Though in Bengal, the English tradition was very strong, everybody studied in English and moved abroad and came back as freedom struggle leaders, still Bengali was a very strong language which came up asserting itself as a spoken communicative language even in the freedom struggle. So, in various parts of India when we are doing it, we find Marathi, Tamil, Bengali as against Hindi became the language of freedom struggle, nationalist movement expression. Literature came about, plenty lectures and bhashan were all given in those regional languages. So, simultaneously with the freedom struggle moving forward, we also had the revival of languages taking place in various parts of India. Along with this revival of languages, we also had a lot of regional icons, regional leadership, regional history, regional past, and old heroes who have stood against the British or stood against any other foreign invaders. Their stories also began to be very popular. So, we had, along with one major freedom struggle, which was led by Gandhi and later on by other leaders, we also had a lot of mini freedom struggles which had come up in various parts of India. So, this moved along with the national movement, strengthened the national movement, and at the same time also strengthened the nationalism in various parts of India. In some places maybe there was a little confrontation or a conflict of interest, but mostly they were really strengthening the national movement with a regional manifestation of regional nationalism. So, that is why sometimes we call the regionalism as a sub-nationalism. There were a lot of subnational movements during the freedom struggle as such. The national leaders recognized it, the regional leaders began coming up using the regional sort of language, regional icons, regional images in order, and regional history, sometimes even regional variation of the major religions in order to bring up nationalist movement in various parts of India. For instance, in Maharashtra region, when then it was called a Bombay Presidency, you have Gita being revived, Ganesh festival being revived, which was very strong in that region in order to bring about nationalism. You do find in South, you have the language coming up as a very big weapon of joining people together and fighting it together. But as we move towards freedom, as we move towards independence of India by 1947, we found many of these sub-nationalist movements continued to exist, because they did not merge themselves. They were parallel, they grew parallelly, they became strong, but they did not merge themselves and lose their identity just because now we have got the national movement and now we have got the freedom achievement as such. So, with the result in India, along with the growth of nationalism, along with the growth of an independent India, we also had simultaneously the coexistence and growth of some of this subnational movement also continuing. It did not take any sort of a conflict of interest, did not take a negative attitude as such, At the same time, it helped us to grow our own literature and gradually bring about more and more textbooks and written material in our own languages, so that we could in turn introduce our own mother tongues in our schools as we went along in the post-independent period. So, the vernacular could change, the medium of instructions could change, and gradually our literature also became very, very strong, and a lot of regional poets began appearing on the thing, regional novelists began coming in, and regional literature began coming in our own country. As it did so, we also found a lot of regional local heroes, regional local literature and folk literature, as well as many other things being revived in our country as such. So, regionalism continued in the post-independent years also. But then at the same time, there were also other types of factors which had gone into our regional movements, even during the nationalist movement period or subsequently after we became independent. One such factor which went into these regional movements definitely is religion. In some parts of India, the religious movements also got a lot of fillip, and you find there were a lot of revivalist movements which came up, particularly in the major religion called Hinduism. So, with the result, you had the beginning of the religious movements which came up in the course of the freedom movement. You have, for instance, Maharashtra, very strong movement came up. So, also in some other parts of India, which later on gave birth to some political parties and movements like Hindu Mahasabha or RSS and others. In some parts of India, it took the shape of caste. The caste movements came up quite a lot, as in the case of Tamil Nadu, a region, or Madras Presidency as it was called before independence, where caste became a very, very important identifying factor among the people. So, you have some sectors, some castes which were very rich economically, but not so influential politically. They were not so influential politically because they did not take recourse to the British education, the English education, the English schools at the earliest. There were the Brahmin caste in Tamil Nadu which took advantage of, or also in Bengal, which took advantage of the British education, learnt their language, the English language, and began moving forward and even went abroad. So, a lot of lawyers, baratlas emerging from these regions. You also had a lot of bureaucrats under the British regime, officials, who also came up from these regions, Bengal and Tamil Nadu region, mainly because they took to the English education much earlier. The Brahminical tradition historically, their dominance in the social life and religious life had given them this advantage which they completely utilized in order to emerge as the most intellectual class in the Indian continent. So, also there is a third factor, it is a commerce and trade. We also find some of these being coastal regions, Bengal, Tamil Nadu or Bombay Presidency or Maharashtra. They had a lot of trade and commerce relationship with the rest of the world, especially the neighborhood world. For instance, from Tamil Nadu, the trade contacts between Tamil Nadu and what presently you call Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and many of these regions in the Southeast Asia was quite a flourishing trade for more than 300 years or 400 years in that particular region, what was sometimes referred to as Greater South India or Greater India. So, this had given the businessman an initial advantage. From the commercial trading class, the economy flourished, capital accumulated, and so Gujaratis and some of these communities in Tamil Nadu and Bengal became the earliest businessmen in this country, because of this commercial capital they could build up because of the trade and commerce. So, you have, by the time India became independent in 1947, you have certain regions of India more developed than other regions. The regions which were under the direct British rule benefited a lot more than the regions which were still under some Maharajas or some Nawabs or some principalities who could not take advantage of these various British exposure. I don't mean to say that the British helped us to do this, no. It is not that way. It is in spite of the British rule that the Indians emerged strong, mainly because they served the purpose of the British colonial rule by learning their language, by learning their bureaucracy, by emerging in the structure. In no way was it a contribution of Britain. It is a contribution by ourselves, our own self-sustaining one. There were some Maharajas, like Mysore Maharaja, who was quite enlightened, and Bhopal Nawab, who were quite enlightened, who brought in many of these reforms in their own states. But by and large, in the interior of India, the impact of the British rule being less, those sections remained a little more backward and undeveloped than the coastal regions of India. So, we have various types of disparities which developed, or distinctions which developed after independence. Some regions being more forward, some being less, some languages being more forward than some languages less, and we found ourselves being ruled by certain sections of the country much more than by certain other sections of the country. It reflected in our politics, it reflected in our bureaucracy, it reflected in our administration, and we ended up quite a lot adopting the British language, the British bureaucratic system, the British structure, official structure, and though we tried to make a lot of changes, this continued for a very, very long time. So, this led to a certain amount of regional disparities, regional differences along with regional identities. With this result, we find that within about 10 years after independence, by about 1955-56, some of these regional identities had begun asserting themselves by participating in the independent politics of this country. For instance, in Tamil Nadu again, during the national movement period, we have a few parties and movements which had come based essentially on caste, but also on the socio-economic factors. We have the Justice Party, we have self-respect movement which led to the Justice Party. We have DK, Dravida Kazhagam as we call it, which based itself essentially on the regional identity called Dravidas, which may be historically right or wrong, that is a different issue. But popularly the image wise, the South Indians call themselves, the Tamilians call themselves as Dravid. With the result, we have the Dravida Kazhagam, which later on became a political party, but also gave birth to another political party called DMK, the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, a branch of it which began coming up as a separate party. Now, these parties, though Justice Party continued to exist on paper, gradually it got weakened out, because many of the members of the Justice Party were very rich, big landlords or big bureaucrats. So, with the result, after independence movement came up, they got merged or they lapsed. But DK and DMK continued to exist very strongly, and whenever there was an attempt in the center to put Hindi as the official language in this country or national language in this country, there was tremendous agitation in Tamil Nadu portion. With the result, we had to compromise on it. So, we did Hindi and English as the two official languages in this country. Until today, we have not yet been able to adopt a national language in this country. And the other regions like Bengal also came up little later to challenge the domination of Hindi as the only national language in the entire country, because each one of them had developed their own culture, their own literature, their own dominance, and have flourished during the freedom movement. So, they were not going to accept the dominance of any one language in this particular country. So, we find the emergence of regional political parties, which even got the strength to contest the elections. By 1957 elections, which is the second elections in this country, we even had one party in Tamil Nadu, the DMK party, had began contesting the election, winning a few states and becoming a member of the state assemblies as such, and emerging as a very strong opposition party to the Congress party in Tamil Nadu. Similar type of tendencies began coming up in other parts of India too. So, over a period of time, we have Akali Dal in Punjab region, And we have in other PWP in Maharashtra region, we have DMK here. So, quite a few parties came up in various parts of India, which began participating in the politics and political processes of the country, and soon began strong enough to contest the even state assembly elections in this country. So, regional politics, regional parties and regionalism as a concept came to stay in India. One thought, many people thought, that once the national building, nation building, national movement and big leaders like Nehru and Patel emerge on the national scene, the regionalism part of it will reduce a bit. It did not. Even though we had a Congress leadership and a Congress party in all parts of India, we also had national leaders coming from these various regions. Still the regional parties continue to exist and becoming strong whenever there was a challenge to the regional identity or the regional culture as such by a sense. So, they became in a way an anti-centralizing force. We could never impose anything on India on a uniform pattern. We had to listen to the voices from grassroots in various parts of India. With the result, India in a way benefited out of it by having a pluralistic, decentralized polity rather than one centralized polity imposed by either one language or one leadership or one party in this country from the very beginning that we began to be independent in this country. So, sometimes regionalism has been a positive advantage to us, though apparently it looks like it is a divisiveness of the country. So, many people in fact prognosticated, prophesied, India will divide itself into 100 pieces, 200 pieces very soon, but we did not. But the claims were there. With the result, in 1956, India attempted a state reorganization, because till 1956 we were only following whatever the British had given us as the various presidencies, though we began calling them as states, not as presidencies. But in the course of the first 10 years, thanks to Patel's effort, our Home Minister Patel's efforts as well as others, more and more of these small principalities had become part of India. They joined the big new India, and many of them merged with India and were prepared to lose their identities. So, you have about 578 principalities or something which we had at the time of independence. Soon we were only left with 2 or 3 reluctant persons who did not want to come to join India, like you have Junagadh, like you have Hyderabad, you have Goa and some other Sikkim, and some of these portions were not joining India, but the rest were with India. So, we find that by the time we come to half of 1950s, the national leadership wanted to bring all these people together and also reward them with recognizing their regional identities. So, even though they became part of India as such, the regional heritage, regional culture, regional richness had to be not merely developed, but accorded recognition. So, in 1956 we had a state reorganization commission appointed by the government of India, and they came out creating states all over India on the basis of linguistic borders, so that no particular language feels left out, and people who talk the same language could be brought about, because administratively as well as culturally this will be much better in the future for those particular identities. So, you had a lot of states born at that time, where by merging them, by dividing them or merging them on the basis of languages, where new states like Odisha was born, which was not there. Andhra Pradesh was born, which was not there before. Portions of Andhra were part of Bengal, portions of Andhra were part of Tamil Nadu, some portions are Madras Presidency, some portions were part of Maharashtra state. So also Maharashtra and Gujarat came to be divided, made into 2 states. So, these various developments took place in 1956, so that then India now became a country which was a national united country based on the regional variations, regional diversity as well as regional aspirations of the people. This helps. The language definitely helped to unite them, at the same time develop them to bring about schools, officials and many others to deal with the mother tongue or the regional language, so that the poorer sections, not so literate sections, not English educated sections could also participate in democracy and development much better than if English had been the only language all over India. So, we have a phenomenon in India ever since that the states have their own language. The center has English essentially, but also Hindi as a communication one. So, every state almost has two languages, one regional, the other national, with which they communicate with all the records, all the documentation, communicate with the other states, communicate with the center and communicate with their own people within their own state. So, this is something of an achievement for India, that we could do it within about 10 years after our independence, and have continued to do so, with the result the participation of rural population, not so educated population, not so developed population, with the democratic advancement of India could be much more concrete and positive. So, that is where we have the freedom struggle as a common thread, the national development as a common thread, and we have continued over a period of time. In times of crisis, in times of a foreign invasion or foreign attack, like attack from China or attack from Pakistan, one has not seen any deviation, any difference, any regional variation, any regional disunity in this country. All the parties, regional or national, all the states, whether governed by the central parties or by the regional parties, have stood united to protect Indian freedom, India's unity, India's land and India's people. So, the regionalism has not been a negative feature in our Indian politics at all. It has continued to be a feature, but at the same time it has not been the bane of India's development as such. So, the integration of Indian states, at the same time the creation of new states based on the languages and tribal identities, this is very important, because language of course is something which we use for major portions of India, but we also have very many states in the northeast, particularly in the northeast, which during the British period were not really going along with the freedom movement so much, because they were remote. They were identified as separate religions, separate separate ethnic identities, and were more under the religious influence of the British rulers. But of course, they were all part of India, they were definitely part of India, and they were brought into India much more integrally after India became independent. But their ethnic identity has to be preserved. Their languages have to be preserved, and in the northeast almost every hill has a separate tribal identity. It is a tribal region, and where almost every hill, as we call it, has a separate ethnic identity. It was our effort, particularly the effort of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, not to lose their culture, not to lose their identity, but allow them to flourish in the same way and preserve and protect their regional culture, regional inheritance and regional identity. So, the northeast also had to be looked into, and so we created 7 states in the northeast, and soon from Assam they separated and became 7 independent states in the northeast. 7 regions now became 7 independent states. We added Sikkim to them. So, now 8 independent states exist in the northeast, each one of them essentially based on ethnic identities, because the ethnic identity also happens to have different languages, but most of them of course do not have a script of their own, with the result English continues to be the dominant script in many of these regions, but still they have their own local literature, they have their own local script, they have their own local religion, local customs, which they follow very, very strongly even till today. So, the State Reorganization Commission once again took care of the regional identities of these regions, and they very vociferously, very eagerly they continue to protect their own entities till today, though sometimes it sounds like big ethnic divisions there. It's not really true. They are really protecting their own ethnic culture, which even pertains to the way they wear their clothes. The women still wear in this country, in these parts of India, their own ethnic dress. They weave their own dress, and it's never available in the market. They weave themselves. Each tribe has its own separate identity or by way of the clothes which they wear, the way they dress up, the hats and the other things which they wear, which is very widely preserved and cultivated till today very eagerly by the various people. So, regionalism is not merely a political concept, it is also a cultural concept. From the culture, the politics has come in. With the help of the politics, they have preserved and sustained their culture in India. This, I think we must realize it, because this helps in our positive attitude towards regionalism in this country, regional identities in this country, regional culture in this country, and preserving the pluralistic nature of our country, which is an extremely important inheritance, which a writer like Verrier Elvin, an anthropologist like him, or Nehru is his great admirer, have been able to preserve for this country in the future. But over the period of time, many of these part of India, these regional parties have become very strong. So much so that they have posed a challenge to the national parties in this country. We see it more and more growing. As of today, there are at least 34 regional parties in this country, and only 7 parties which we call it as the national parties in this country. We also know that each one of these parties have their own aim, very regionally oriented aim. Again, to take the example of language, preservation and protection of the language is one of the aims of all these regional movements. Secondly, to bring in the economic development of that particular region and seeing how that region gets what is due. For a long time, the demand of the Madras people was that they are being bypassed by the national ones, and the development of the country is very much lopsided and biased in favor of the north. They used to go on talking about it for a very long time, and that became almost the demand of the regional party like DMK. So much so, even the national parties, their local branches had to adopt this so that they can compete with the regional parties, but at the same time also focus on the lack of development of their own region as such. So, one of the most important demands of the regional parties in various parts of India, one is cultural, the other is socio-economic development. So, that became the policy plank of many of these regional parties. With the result, they became extremely popular among their own states and population. So, they began emerging as powerful political parties in the regions. So, by 1957 elections and later on, these regional parties began giving a challenge to national politics, because till that time almost it was the monopoly or at least domination of the Indian National Congress all over India, with a weak presence or a powerful presence of the Communist Party of India in some parts of India like Kerala, Tamil Nadu or Bengal or Maharashtra. But later on, these regional parties came and replaced or at least diluted a lot of these national parties as such. So, you find once it goes on, by 1967 elections, which is the 4th general elections in India, a lot of regional parties even became the ruling parties, either by themselves or by coalition with the other political parties. So, we have in the performance in 1967 elections was such that the national parties like Indian National Congress were really reduced. The Communist Party of India, of course, prevailed in some states like Kerala, Bengal and Tripura in coalition with other regional ideological parties, but only in 2 or 3 states. In the other states, it was quite a few of these states became coalition politics with the help of these various regional parties joining up together, some of them split parties of the Congress, but the Congress was really wiped out as a major party in almost 7 to 8 states of India. which came up by 1967 elections and continued later, and perhaps even to some extent continues till today. So, the coalition politics in the states came up instead of the single dominant party government in various parts of India. Congress lost its monopoly status. The inheritance from the Indian national movement gradually got diluted. So, one began counting the number of states which Congress was ruling and counting the number of states where Congress was not ruling. After 1967, this phenomenon has continued to stay in India, though in 1971 elections, Congress came back with a dominant majority in Lok Sabha. It could not reflect or continue this as a dominant party in the various states of India. So, regional parties began to dilute the Congress party in the states, even though Congress itself, after the Bangladesh war and liberation of Bangladesh, came up as a very dominant party in the center. So, this is where you have a different type of politics begin to take place after 1967 and particularly after 1991, because in between we have few years other things came like the emergency and many other things, and parties joined up together and formed the Janata Front. Even the Janata Party, when it was formed after the emergency in 1977, consisted of quite a few regional parties which merged themselves into the national one, and also some of the regional parties supporting the Janata government against the emergency, since they all had suffered quite a bit during the emergency, that regional parties still had a role to play in the national parties, along with the national parties and the national politics as such. So, this phenomenon has continued from that time. Initially, these sort of coalitions, this sort of regional parties forming the government looked very unstable and unsettled. While we have one Congress party which gave a stable government, a settled government in the first 20-30 years of independence, a little later the politics began to be a little more in a fluff. Everybody began thinking it's instability which is causing this country's lack of development, which may not be true, because how we measure the development becomes an extremely important aspect. It is not just merely per capita growth or something like this, but many other things become part of the variations of our development. With the result, after 1991, once again when we had this phenomenon, we found even from 1975 or even 70, some states of India never really voted for the national parties. Once again, the example of Tamil Nadu becomes very important. Example of Punjab becomes very important. A regional party got stabilized and stood its ground even after 1970s. Though we did not have a regional party combination in Bengal, but the left parties in Bengal and Kerala and Tripura stood their ground. So, with the result, we have a regional variations of the national parties like the Communist Party of India, Communist Party Marxist in these various regions. So, India did not, it has begun to have a rainbow type of politics in this, and today we find that there is a continuation of these regional politics. It is now very difficult to imagine that we will have a politics in this country or a political process in this country which is without regional parties. It is even very difficult to imagine either at the center or in the states of India that one or two political parties will dominate the whole show. Though at times, like in the center, we have two major parties, namely the BJP and the Congress, but neither BJP nor Congress is able to stand by itself. Even they have to get the alliance of various political parties. So, you find, for instance, even though the BJP has a majority in the Lok Sabha today after the recent elections in May 2014, it still has an Akali Dal, it still has a Shiv Sena as its partners. Why? Mainly because in the national level you may not require an ally, but at the state level you definitely require them as alliance partners. The recent election Maharashtra also has confirmed this, that even though BJP is in the center with a big majority. The same BJP, when it came to state politics or state elections in Maharashtra, could not get the majority. The same BJP had to ally with a PDP in Jammu and Kashmir to form a government. So, what happens in the center need not happen in the states. There is a variation which is emerging in Indian politics between the center and the states. In center, you have additional fields like defense and foreign policy, for which perhaps a national party is better equipped to deal with. Finance for the entire India, a national party may be better to deal with. But in the states which do not have defense and foreign policy and only a state oriented finance, you may be able to deal with the regional parties better. So, the regional parties are strong in the states in this country, but the regional parties are also emerging as an inevitable partners in the central government in this country. In elections which had a majority from the national parties, they still have a regional party as an ally, mainly because they need them for forming the state governments. For instance, Congress, even though it was a big majority in the center, still had NCP as its ally in the center, even though they had only a small number of seats, mainly because it required NCP to form the government in Maharashtra. So, this became a very firmly cemented alliance between them. So, whether one requires an alliance partner, one requires a regional party or not, one has continued with them, because that is the exigency of the day, and more than that, that has come to be established as a concept of Indian politics, namely the regional parties will not be merely confined to the region. In fact, this came up even before. Even in 1957, when DMK emerged as an important regional party to be the opposition party in the state assembly, by 1962 election, a lot of DMK members began contesting the national elections and became members of the Lok Sabha. Logically, a regional party should worry about the region, the demands of the region, but then they soon realized it. Even the demands of the region can be met only when they begin participating in the national politics, make their demands felt at the national parliament and not merely within the region. So, DMK began participating in national politics, and an important leader of DMK, the important leader, C.N. Annadurai, as we call them Anna, he participated in the national parliament. Similarly, other regions also began to be interested in the national politics, national parliament. So, they began sending in their own people into the parliament as such. After the 1977 elections, when the Janata government formed the government in the center, you had a lot of regional parties, ministers of regional parties becoming ministers of important portfolios like defense, like foreign policy. Like all these were given not merely to the national parties, but were also to those regional parties like Socialist Party or like Samajwadi Socialist Party. They began to be their defense ministers, George Fernandez, Mulayam Singh Yadav. These are people who became our defense ministers and not just ministers for marginalized departments, which means the regional parties acquired a certain amount of strength, popularity as well as importance in the national scene too, and did not confine themselves as the regional party as such. So, we have moved into an era now that where we have to recognize the regional parties as part of our national politics, not confine them to just the region. Reverse wise, the regional parties also have understood their concern is not merely what happens in the region, only their politics, their language, their religion or their caste, but also find out what is happening in the rest of the country and align themselves with the entire national scene and what is happening in national politics as such. So much so now that you find the national parties really in a way appeasing the regional parties, trying to meet them, trying to go along with them, listen to them. For instance, there are pressure points which the regional parties are exerting a lot on the national politics. We know, for instance, Bangladesh. 2 days back, we had signed an agreement with Bangladesh for an exchange of territory between India and Bangladesh. This was stalled and stalled and stalled for a very long time, because the particular regional parties which were ruling West Bengal were not, or Assam, were not totally agreeable to it. So, the regional parties can act as points of pressure on the national politics, and the national politics cannot move by bypassing the regional parties. Similarly, we find anything which is happening in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan local politics, their autonomy movement, their language issue, the LTTE issue, and today the fishermen issue. Every third day some fishermen are getting caught in those waters, Indian fishermen. All these issues are very much points on which the Tamil Nadu government, Tamil Nadu political parties, the regional parties in Tamil Nadu are able to put a lot of pressure on the national party, the ruling party in the center. So, no longer the national parties can bypass the regional parties, wherever it may be. The same is true about Shiva Sena and Maharashtrian politics. Issues on which Shiva Sena feels very strong, and at that time the national party, whoever is ruling at the center, whether it is BJP or Congress, will have to respond and listen to the Shiva Sena's point of view. So, we find that way that India is a combination of national and regional parties. Somewhere the regional parties are very, very strong, somewhere the national parties are more strong, and depending on the electoral verdict, the national parties or the regional parties rule the states. Right now, for instance, in more than 10 states of India, is the regional parties which in coalition with the national party or alone by itself has formed the government. Out of 29 states in India, more than 10 states, we have the regional parties which are the ruling parties, and the national parties only become opposition parties, or sometimes not even that. Even the opposition party is another regional party, like in Tamil Nadu again. If the ADMK is ruling, DMK becomes opposition party. If the DMK is ruling, ADMK becomes opposition party. So, with the national parties basically out of real exercise of political power in these countries. Though they have not gone away, though they have their roots, they have their following, they have they still put across many things and contest even the elections. The regional parties have totally taken over some of these states. Kashmir is another one, Jammu and Kashmir was one, Tamil Nadu is another, and the whole northeast, the 6 states in the northeast, except Assam, the 7 states in the northeast, do not have any national parties being very important influential factors, whether it is Meghalaya or Mizoram or Nagaland, Manipur, we find the regional parties are ruling the roost for a very long time. So, this is where we need to understand regionalism in India. We need to understand, before imposing any policy or any platform or formulating any policy, one has to understand the implications of these parties, the manifestation of people's will in various parts of India. Any national party which goes roughshod on the regional aspirations or regional views or regional demands or regional variations will definitely not find itself successful in course of time. So, India thereby has become politically, geographically a very pluralistic nation, a pluralistic democracy. So, even those parties which come to central power, even those movements which come to central influence, or even those organizations which believe they are ruling India and that their point of view is the majority point of view, just because they belong to a religion which is a majority religion, or a language which is spoken by more people than other languages, they still cannot think. So, that is where we find Hindi is still not able to impose itself on the rest of India. Below Vidarbha, Hindi is still only a language for commerce, petty commerce purposes, not for official or any other region or higher education class or professional classes in this country. We also find in the same way Hinduism definitely a majoritarian religion, but then it cannot impose itself on the various states of India for the simple reason there are states where concentration of other religions, other identities, other regional variations, other ethnic identities are quite strong. because the so-called minority religions in our country are also concentrated in certain regions more than in certain other regions. They are prevalent all over India, they are existing all over India, but in some regions more than in some other regions. Then in those cases, the regional politics has to take into note the prevalence of these concentrated communities within their own region. So, definitely a national party, a national government, a majoritarian party or a majoritarian government cannot really aggregate to itself the powers. For instance, even now the ruling party BJP is quite a bit a North Indian party. It is not very strong in the south, it is not very strong in the east, it is only at the most the central India and a little bit of western India in this country, Maharashtra, Gujarat, central region in this country. The same was true about Congress. Very much it was a centralized party, central party with very little influence either in the south or in Tamil Nadu or in the northeast as such. So, every party has its own weak points. Every party cannot assert itself as it is a national party, but may not be called as an all India party in equal sense of the word, though they have their presence, their organization in various parts of India. So, this political process, this party contingencies of various political parties make them listen and respond to the demands of the various regions if they continue to be continued in power. And every national party would like to come to power in various parts of India, like to develop its roots in various parts of India, not merely only in the Hindi speaking region. So, which means they have to understand, they have to respect the opinions of the various regions in this country. So, regionalism thereby, in my view, is a very strong aspect of our democracy, of political operation, of political process, and our politics will have to realize this, the impact of regional parties. Otherwise, even an NDA government in 1999 could not have been formed, though BJP was a strong factor in the NDA politics. There were 22 parties which were there in that coalition. Out of these 22, quite a lot were part of regional parties in this country. The same is true about Congress, which has been getting various regional parties to support it. Then or even today, when the Congress is trying to bring up a resolution in Rajya Sabha or elsewhere in Lok Sabha for or against anything, it seeks the support of the regional parties in UP, Bihar, Bengal, Tamil Nadu and very many other regions, because no party, no national party can claim to represent the entire India anymore. It never did, but now it can never do it even electoral politics wise. So, alliances have come to play a very big role, they have come to stay in this country. So, at the time of elections, all the national parties tried to reach alliances with the regional parties. Now, we find even after the elections, whether it is ruling or whether it is in opposition, it tries to continue with these regional alliances with the regional parties, because without it, it has no base, no working in every part of India as such. So, this we need to understand, our rulers need to understand, and the regional parties need to understand, because ultimately regional parties are one weakness, one very important weakness. They do not spread beyond their boundaries. None of the Tamil regional parties have thought in terms of going to other regions, because they then, even if they attempt, they fail. TMC, Trinamool Congress, tried to compete in Tripura, Bihar and the other areas during the recent elections, did not get even one seat. It was known as a regional party of Bengal, and it was confined to Bengal by the electorate. So, this is Samajwadi Party, same issue. They contested a lot of elections in Maharashtra, but could not win even a single seat in Maharashtra. Akali Dal tried it, could not get it. Shiva Sena tried to put up a candidate in Delhi elections, could not get even one candidate elected, maybe they even lost the deposit. So, which means that it is expected of the regional parties to confine themselves to a region, otherwise they are not regional parties. And if they try to go beyond those boundaries, because their origin their growth, their demands, their main policy planks, their ideology, all of them are confined by within a narrow boundary as they came into being and continue to grow. So, if they want to continue, they have to expand their ideology, they have to expand their vision, they have to think in terms of the demands not merely for their own region, but other regions, and finally, they have to emerge as national parties, at least more than. As far as the election commission goes, it recognizes them as a national party only if they contest in 6 states of India. So, they continue to be regional parties, which is the way perhaps they can contribute a lot more to that region than by ambition wise emerging into national party wise. I hope we understand that regional parties is a permanent part of India's democratic and governance framework as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this lecture today. Of course, we have more to follow as ma'am would be here talking about a certain different topic tomorrow. So, friends, stay tuned in, and for this lecture, thank you so much, ma'am, for being here today. Thank you, friends. Have a great day.